My guest today is Tom Moroli, a dedicated political organizer, historian, and former candidate for state senate. Tom served on the Massachusetts Democratic State Committee and has been involved with the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. His deep knowledge of American political history, from the evolution of party structures to the shifting dynamics of power, offers a fascinating lens through which we can understand where we've been and where we're headed. In this conversation, we dive into the historical cycles of American politics, from early Federalists and Jeffersonians to modern day political realignments. We also touch up on the role for political parties, the impact of economic forces on governments, and whether we may be witnessing the decline of an era in American history. Tom brings a wealth of insight into how power has shifted over time. This was an engaging and thought provoking discussion that I think you'll really enjoy. And now, without further ado, Tom Moroli.
Yeah, thanks for joining, Tom. Tom Moroli, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm Tom Moroli. I've been a few different things. Um I I've been town committee, sat on the um Massachusetts Democratic State Committee for the state party. Um I've I've ran for state senate. Um I've worked in government. I've been involved with the Democratic Socialists of America, um, among other things.
So you've been
Just
pretty
because
politically active
have been
for,
involved in the Democratic Party. Yeah, and I just want to say, just because I've been involved with the Democratic Party, I wouldn't call myself necessarily a Democratic Party loyalist. Um,
right.
I'm I'd say that my main reason for interfacing with them was because of a way to push the ideology within the party now. And we can discuss absolutely how that's turned out.
Yeah, well, I
um
think we both
but
agree mostly
uh
on how it's turned out.
yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, beyond that, I've been like kind of a local historian. I've been on the Minden Historical Society, or historical commission. I've written about party politics, researched about party politics throughout the world, um, pretty extensively, and documented a history of who, I have a documented history of who's held which Senate seat throughout history, who's held which congressional seat throughout history. And during the pandemic, I kind of charted it in a huge graph to kind of you can see the ebbs and flow of power in each state and
Hmm.
each country in the world. Um, I've kind of wrote the history. Actually, I did research at the state archives, was able to access primary sources to see the actual election results from, so I could do it for this area as well. So that was very interesting to kind of see. And it's also difficult because back in the day, you didn't actually vote for any president.
Right.
You would directly for an elector. But the thing is, you wouldn't see the name of who that elector was supporting. So I had to figure out based on the electors' names who was for which party, you know. Um, so that was an interesting. It's very interesting how much things have changed, like over the
Yeah, it
course of
went
my
from a
career.
true representative, what, because technically we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional representative republic, I think is the right
Yeah,
word for the United States government.
I would call ourselves a liberal democratic republic.
Sure.
Liberal being that, and I don't mean liberal as in like libs or like the modern sense. Um, liberal as in the ideology of liberalism, which puts the notion of individual liberty at its core. Which I would say that the U.S. government, I would say the U.S. government, um, I'd say like all of our documents, both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, individual liberty is kind of the guiding
Right.
Um,
Right. Like that's how
I
it's
was
supposed to work.
guiding lodestar behind it. Um, and these political parties that we deal with today weren't originally anticipated. You know, um, those developed almost immediately
Yeah.
because different factions had different ideas of what the revolution meant, um, and that sort of thing. Um, and also of note, one founding father, Thomas Paine, actually was completely ostracized by the other founding fathers because of his wacko beliefs on a public pension system for all American citizens that they could take part in, you know,
Mm-hmm.
rather which you could later look at as Social Security. And interestingly enough, early socialists weren't called socialists. They actually they were referred to as Painites because they espoused sort of um some sort of belief system uh that resembled some of the stuff that Thomas Paine was talking about. So, the US actually, our political parties aren't political parties in the normal sense. Um, like if you go, for example, if you go to the UK, um, you go to a lot of the parliamentary systems,
Right.
um, parties have the ability to enforce discipline, right? They can essentially they can knock you off the ballot for the next go around from that party position. You can essentially just say, nope, you're not part of the party anymore. We're subbing someone else in for you. Um,
What do you think of that?
what was that?
What do you think of that?
I mean, there's conflicting views on that because on the one hand, if you have someone who if you have a party platform that says, hey, we support this, and then you have individuals saying, well, I'm not voting for that. You know,
Right.
I mean, their view is the party's elected to do this, so that's what we have to do. You're running as a member of the party. Here, the view is you're an individual running for the seat, and the party comes after, right? So, um, and some would argue that what happens is, political party machines can kind of blame their more uh like some of their members that aren't as aligned with the guiding ideology of the party when things go wrong. You
Like
know,
let's look at
um,
Kristen Sinema or Joe Manchin in
yeah, right. Well,
2022,
exactly.
ruining everything. Oh no, we hands
Well, you
tied.
don't.
Yeah.
The thing is, you don't have that in like parliamentary systems as much because, and that's not to say people don't vote against their party. Sometimes they do, but it's much rarer because the party has mechanisms to enforce discipline. We have more or less what are ballot lines, you know,
Right. Right.
we
Right.
have loose confederations of people who ostensibly believe in a certain ideology um, that hold a line on the ballot. Um, and at first, that's exactly how it operated as well. The idea of party conventions and primaries and um, the inter-party politicking and nominating nominating conventions, that that was something that came later. So the political parties started originally as loose groups of people who ascribed to a certain ideology. Um,
Right.
and the very first one in American history, like the first major party,
Is it the Federalists?
it was the Federalists.
Oh,
Well, so the Federalists kind of were founded in support of what George Washington's policies. Um, and their power base was strongest in the Northeast. And so I divide American history into a few different when we're talking political parties, a few different eras. We have the first one we can call the Federalist era. Then the Jeffersonian era, which was from 1801 to 1824. Then the Jacksonian era was from 1824 till about 1855-ish, 56. Then the Civil War and Reconstruction era, which
Right.
lasted from the 1860 until roughly 1900 or so.
Yeah, like the
The
Industrial Revolution is kind of like, and we're moving, everything's changed.
Yeah, right. Well, and then you have what's called the Progressive era,
Right.
um, which started in the early 1900s and lasted until the Great Depression, um, 1930 or 1928. Um, and then you have what is widely considered the New Deal era from the start of the Great Depression through, and this is where there tends to be disagreement, is when the New Deal era actually ended. I consider the end of it in 1968, when Nixon got elected.
Okay.
Um, a lot of people say it was 1980 when Reagan got elected. However, um, I see I see as some of the trends that got Nixon elected um, were the same trends that got Reagan elected like 12 years later. Um, and I'll explain that in a bit. But then, then we're in this sort of era, the era of neoliberalism and Reaganism, um, that I think that's the era that's just come more or less come to an end.
Yeah, I
We're
think it's, and this is interesting. I hate to, interrupt you here, but I think it's really interesting that like we're reaching this point now where we're talking about widely like the end of an empire or like the end of American hegemony or
Yeah.
whatever that means. Because I think you're right. It's like we're at the end of this era that's been going on for several decades now. And it's like this is the first time this has happened in most people's lives. Like you were even mentioning through the 18 or even 1900s, things were moving a little bit quicker, or even in the inception of this country. But now it's like things are coming to a head. What do you think it is that causes, let's say, these eras to shift or to change?
Well, I think there's a few different things, right? And we have to go all the way back to the beginning again, right? The Federalists, because there's been two more or less throughout the major parties, there's been two more or less ideologies that have been persistent, right?
Right.
Um, Hamiltonianism and Jeffersonianism. Um, Hamiltonian, Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the top lieutenants for George Washington,
A foreigner.
a foreigner, yeah, no, so an immigrant,
Yeah.
right? Who developed the U.S. Treasury system, um, developed the sort of economic system he, that became known as the American system, which was the system of tariffs and internal improvements in finance that spurned the modernization of the country. Um, you know, that required a strong central government to do so.
Hmm.
Versus Thomas Jefferson, who was very much against this, who
There's
said,
more states' rights and that
well, he
smaller.
was his view was more like, okay, so this shouldn't be a nature of merchants and craftsmen. This should be a nation of farmers, each with their own property, that
Hmm.
should be largely left alone. And you know, ironically enough, he's the one that expanded the country, doubled the country in size, but through the Louisiana Purchase. But that's sort of those two kind of competing ideologies, I'd say, have um, have sort of been in the background of the party system since. So the Federalists, George Washington got elected twice. Um, he was unopposed. Everybody loved George Washington. There, he was not a Federalist. He was not a member of any political party, but he was very much associated with the Federalists because the Federalists sort of cropped up around his policies um, in support of them. When the anti-Federalists were the anti-administration members of Congress that didn't like what George Washington was doing, um, those became what we call now the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. And like I said, they supported kind of a smaller government, smaller federal government. They did not like the internal sort of building of modern, like using the federal government to enact modernizations, infrastructure, roads, bridges, that sort of thing. Again, they wanted a nation of farmers who had their farms, you know, were being left alone. And also the Federalists very much supported a strong trade policy and foreign policy with Great Britain, whereas the Anti-Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, were very much on board with revolutionary France. That's because the Democratic Republicans considered the French Revolution to be sort of the next step, right? Like we had this revolution here in the U.S. that the revolution's coming there now. We have to support them. The Federalists wanted stability and said, hey, we can't spurn our Great Britain would be our biggest trading partner. We can't, as a new fledgling country, spurn, turn back on Great Britain. We can't just like close our ports to them and embargo that. We have to trade with them. We need a close relationship with them. We should kind of squash our beef and the Federalists, of course, maintained power throughout the first decade of this country, but once Thomas Jefferson won in 1800, his ideas became ascendant. The smaller government thing, the close relationship with France, this
Slavery got pushed back 20 years a couple of times.
Slavery not even like the thing about slavery is slavery not only got pushed back, it was illegal to talk about in Congress.
Right, because they
So
were like, we're not talking about this. What
well,
was it, 27 years, 26 years they said that? And then they
yeah,
revisited it,
right.
20 something years later, and they were
Yeah,
like, no, it's still too
correct.
early.
Yeah, no, so they basically they're like, let's not even talk about this because it's gonna, it would just divide the country. Um, you know, the only founding father not owning slaves actually was John Adams from Massachusetts,
Right,
who, you know, say what you want about his presidency. At the very least, he passed that moral bar for sure. But the thing is, the Federalists, even though Thomas Jefferson won, the Federalists persisted till after the War of 1812, when the Federalists, of course, who were close with Britain, were suing for peace during the War of 1812. Basically, like, no, you'll destroy the country. This is gonna, and it didn't. So more or less, while after the war they were seen as traitors by a lot of the public. They were seen as like helping foreigners, helping our enemy. They persisted locally in New England, but more or less the Democratic Republican Party became the only political party in the United States.
right.
Which
And
meant
the
a lot of
Democratic Party came first, and then the Republican Party came, I don't
well,
remember, a
so this
decade
is
or two
still
later.
this is still the Democratic Republican Party, right? This
Oh, they
is
were
still Thomas
together.
Jefferson. Well, it was called the Democratic Republicans. That was the name of the
Okay,
party. And the Federalists still persisted on the local level, in Massachusetts especially. But they didn't have any candidates fielded for national office, for the presidency. They didn't contest the elections. They had some Senate seats. They had some Congress seats. Um, and then came the election of 1824. You have four candidates from the same party running. John Quincy Adams. Because what happened is a lot of former Federalists became Democratic Republicans.
Before we get too bogged down in the details of 230 years ago, I think it'd be better if we just kind of
Yeah, yeah. I'm getting to there.
Okay.
Yeah. So Andrew Jackson lost that election. Um, but he formed this new sort of populist ideology called Jacksonianism, which again it was very much in the spirit of the original Thomas Jefferson, um, where it was very populist. It was very much small government, but he'd take on different institutions like the National Bank. Unlike the Democratic Republicans, original ones, he was very much like against institutions.
Hmm.
So the Supreme Court, well, whereas the Democratic Republicans, like we have all these institutions that tell you like to support small government that say what you can and can't do. Instead, Andrew Jackson came in and said, "I'm moving the Native Americans," and the Supreme Court
Right.
said, "Don't do that." And he said, "No, I'm going to." And so a lot of the former Federalists who switched, along with this other party called the Anti-Masonic Party, which was the first third party in the country, formed the Whigs. And the Whigs were
Hmm.
basically like the TJS party, or sorry, JDS party, the Jackson Derangement Syndrome party, in that their entire party platform was essentially like screw Andrew Jackson, and they ran on that for 20 years. Um, and the thing with the Whigs is they didn't take a strong stance on slavery, whereas the Democratic Party became more and more associated with the agrarian South. The Whigs became associated with the manufacturing class in the North, and they the Whigs basically dissolved over the issue of slavery. At which point, a new party formed with former Whigs, and this is very important. There was a bunch of revolutions going on in Europe in 1848, and a lot of people got kicked out and they came here, dissidents.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of them, a lot of abolitionists, they formed the Republican Party in Wisconsin in the early 1850s. That became the second major party in the country. Of note, a lot of these European revolutionaries, the official Republican Party newspaper, they're like, oh, we need a foreign correspondent in Europe. And some of the European revolutionaries that helped found the Republican Party said, hey, I know a guy in Europe. There's this guy named Karl Marx. He's this awesome writer. He can be the so Karl Marx's only job was as the foreign correspondent. Only actual like stable job was as the foreign correspondent for the Republican Party's official newspaper. That's something I like to little piece of trivia I like to bust out all the time.
That's so
But
funny.
um, yeah, no, it's hilarious. But yeah, so the Republican Party became the anti-slavery, well, not necessarily anti-slavery, but they were not willing to see the country split apart over the issue of slavery. And there's a large abolitionist faction of it. Obviously, the Civil War was fought. The Republican or the North won. The Republicans became ascendant. And again, so you had a strong labor backing, as I talked about, um, in the Republican Party, um, as well as a strong business backing because the manufacturing class in the North very much was supporting them. Those were all the old Whigs. At which point, business people were like, "Hey, yeah, let's not do that whole labor thing anymore. Um, Manufacturing is awesome now. The South's been devastated, and like our tariffs and protectionism because the Republican Party's always supported tariffs. Um, that's actually one thing that's been pretty consistent. Uh, um, they became much more of a big business party after the war because, and as immigrants were coming in, Catholic immigrants, they gravitated towards the Democratic Party after the war because their bosses were all Republicans. Um, you know,
Mm.
in so
So would you
that
say that's how that kind of shift happened? Because I never quite understood like how.
well, yeah. So what happened is the Democratic Party started as a people's party, right? Like
Right.
as a um, yeah. So just
Okay.
to briefly where we were at. So the Civil War has ended. The manufacturing's ascendant, um, as is in the Republican Party at this point, represents skilled laborers and manufacturers and hardcore abolitionists who are just raking the South over the coals because they won. Um, Ulysses S. Grant isn't letting state governments send senators to office until they adopt the Equal Rights Amendment, or until they adopt the abolition era amendments. Um, the Democratic Party represents poor farmers and increasingly um, unskilled immigrant labor that's
Was
coming from
was
Catholic
Grant
countries.
president at that time? Right, because he
Grant was
wasn't.
president
Okay.
right after the Civil War.
So the
And he
president wasn't letting senators from different states come until they
Well, yeah. So
adopted.
basically, during Reconstruction, there were several governments of the South that had to be quote unquote what they called reconstructed. They had military governments, um,
Right,
and more or less, they were arguing, hey, they're reconstructed now. They can, you know, but like, I mean, there's a faction of the Republican Party that controlled it called the Radical Republicans, who are radical abolitionists. I would say probably the most left-wing faction to hold a political party in history. Um, and the only reason they won, like they were able to hold power, is because of the Civil War. Um, More or less, they basically said, no, you need to adopt the equal rights. You need to adopt the amendments we passed before the Civil War ended, which only passed because Democrats from the South were still in secession. Um, you need to adopt these amendments as part of your state constitution and let black people vote, or else we're not letting you send senators to Congress.
right.
We're not letting you elect your own governors. We're not letting you because you haven't been reconstructed yet. And um, that happened under Grant. There were more moderate factions of the Republican Party that would gain power in successive years. There's one very close election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, where Samuel Tilden, who, as the cities in the North started becoming more Catholic and Democrats started becoming more competitive, that the race was tied in the Electoral College. And Rutherford B. Hayes said, I'll end Reconstruction early if you let me be president. Which he did. Um, Also, of note, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln adopted a paper currency, much like we have now, called a greenback.
Hmm.
Um, but that caused inflation. And so the farmers liked inflation, the poor farmers, because it would cause the price of their goods that they were selling to go up. Um,
Yeah.
whereas the whereas the laborers in the North hated inflation because it caused their wages to stagnate. So you kind of had this fight between the farmers and the laborers. Um, and that's important because the Democratic Party um, started holding on to there's this third party that formed called the Populist Party that was for a non-gold backed currency because they backed the dollar to gold because they wanted to get inflation under control. But the poor farmers from the Populists wanted it to stay inflationary. So the Democrats became more to win elections and stay competitive. They formed alliances with the populists more and more. And the populists again were poor farmers from the West. They started supporting things local state um, local state banks that give government money to things. So more or less, the Democratic Party started becoming more of a party that supported government intervention in the economy because of their connections with the populists and poorer farmers, and the Republican Party started supporting the manufacturers more.
And one thing that's important to note here too is that this is still pre-industrial revolution
Well,
before
yeah,
everything is still going. So
this is as the Industrial Revolution is happening.
right. So
Um,
but it's before, so at that point in time, more people were farmers than anything else. So like people weren't
Correct.
living in towns or cities, people were living on their
Well,
homestead,
I
working
would
in
I
the
would say
fields.
this is the point when cities were really starting to grow.
Starting, yeah.
This is the point when cities and like it was around the time that this really started to turn things. Um, and you know, in the early 1900s, the Democratic Party was fully controlled by the populists. They elected somebody who was a populist originally named William Jennings Bryan. Um, and he's kind of a footnote in history, but he's very important because he directly, I would say he kind of directly started um the notion of just railing against the rich elitists and that sort of thing on the national stage. Um, he gave the famous Cross of Gold speech. He he lost the election to William McKinley, who very much was like, "Hey, I think that we should we should support our businesses and we should support them abroad as well. We should, America should start probably expanding overseas." Who was the Republican in that race? Um, Other movements started popping up. You had the Socialist Party was connected with the labor unions, which were still illegal, um, but which were spreading like wildfire amongst organized laborers in major cities after things like the Bread and Roses strike, among other things. Um, and it was in this backdrop of, you know, rapid industrialization that progressivism was a movement that started forming, which was more or less this notion that, hey, we've strayed. It was almost religious in a sense, where it said, hey, all these bad things are happening because of industrialization, and because of the nation we live in. Let's use the government to heal some of these ills. Of note, it wasn't necessarily class based. Um, it wasn't because the socialists were distinct at that time, but the progressives more or less were like, hey, this is all like natural. This is like the natural growing pains of a country. And they did everything from bust up the monopolies that were the, they did everything from bust. I'm sorry, do you hear the dog in the background?
A little bit, but don't worry about it.
Okay, okay. Um, they did everything from busting up monopolies that they saw as putting children in factories, you know,
Are we
putting
already in the
labor.
1900s?
We just got into the 1900s.
Yeah, another important thing of note too, because I'll just periodically give some context, is that, and I just looked it up too, just to make sure, this is just a decade after Nietzsche said God is dead and we have killed him, and then followed on to say, and there isn't enough blood to there's enough water to wash the blood of all
Right,
whatever
right,
in the streets. But part of the whole movement, because you were saying like a religion and like a religious and things like changing. So society from being, these factory workers that everybody went to church and everybody was God-fearing and this is what they did and this was their like circle purview and that's it. They went from that to starting largely to shift into more of a like more of a liberal, what is it, socially liberal, even by their standards. And instead of worshiping God so much, yeah, I don't have to go to church on Sundays. I'm going to go to work and I'm going to whatever. And as society started to move, and especially after
yeah.
all of the mess, like you were saying, all the revolutions occurring in Europe and all the bloodshed and all the everything
Well,
that was
there's
happening in
this
that
this
century.
civil war happening here that
Exactly. And
killed a
then
generation.
plus the
Um,
Trail of Tears and all the Native Americans that were murdered and everything there, and it's like this whole push away from this Christian centric world, and it's like, well, something is gonna fill that void because
there was also and keep in mind, prior to the Great Depression, depressions were a natural part of the market cycle. So
yeah.
you had a depression in 1876, for example, that completely tanked the savings of a lot of the poorer farmers and laborers in the country. Um, so you're at this time when people who are looking at this and saying, "Look, we can use government to make things better. We can better people." Like the notion was we can make people better. Uh,
Yeah,
that
but
was
like that's kind of like the central push ever. I mean, look back at caveman days. There's a reason that humans got together in tribes because
right.
when one person was starving in the tribe, everybody was starving in the tribe. And it's like at a certain point in history, we stopped being this interconnected thing and started, and it's like I'd like to, sorry, my cat's over here. Tina, off.
No, that's cool.
I'd like to say that it was the nuclear family that kind of kicked it off, but maybe it was the nuclear family that was like the nail in the coffin to that sort of community living. You know what I'm saying?
Right, right, absolutely. And you know, like it's of note though that again the early progressive movement was not like a class. based, we need revolution. It was kind of it was like um paternal in a sense. It was very much like a look, hey, our society is messed up. Like the meat conditions are horrible. We need to fix those meat conditions. Also of note, how you have desks perfectly in a line?
Hmm.
Like the whole like classic classroom where like you have people standing up to pledge allegiance to the flag and like, everybody's sitting in their perfect row of desks. Those are holdovers from the progressive era because the thought was, we need people to be in these lines because they, you know, like this is how they learn better.
I
This will
wonder if
better
that
their
lines
education.
up with modernism.
It does in a sense. I believe it does. Like it's all kind of part of the same kind of movement.
That's
But the
interesting. Yeah.
um you know and you had advocates for progressivism of emerge in both of course there were the conservative business people that were like, hey, I don't want this messing with my money. I also a lot of them very much supported the overseas efforts of presidents like McKinley, who fought the Spanish-American War, among other things. But you had advocates for progressivism emerge in both the Republican and Democratic parties. Um, so, like Teddy Roosevelt busted trusts, so did Taft.
Right.
Even though Taft was more of a conservative. You had Woodrow Wilson in like the Democratic Party. Also, the populists who had controlled the Democratic Party at this point, um, latched onto a lot of the progressive era ideals, or that were the progressives were pushing, because the progressives more or less were like, hey, that thing you said with the government paying money to help poor farmers, that's great. That's basically in line with what we're saying. It helped improve people. Um, so you had
Right. And
advocates for
that's
progressive.
kind of where they really started to focus on, well, let's start to drive the economy or drive society and focus on how things should be, as opposed to all the
Yeah,
freedoms of
well,
everybody
if you
lives.
think about it, if you really think about it, though, it's more or less the same stuff Hamilton was pitching.
Right. What you were saying.
Yeah, it's more or less the same stuff Hamilton was pitching, just a redux. And the hands-off approach to the more conservative elements of the time was very much in line with Jefferson. Um, 1912, Woodrow Wilson. Well, actually, Teddy Roosevelt being president, Taft became president. 1912, Woodrow Wilson won in a four-way race. Um, Woodrow Wilson was the Democratic nominee. Um, Teddy Roosevelt was mad because he lost the Republican primary, or the convention nominated William Howard Taft, and so he went off and founded his own
The
party, the Progressive
Bull
Party,
Moose
the
Party.
Blue Moose
The
Party,
Bull
right?
Moose.
And it should be noted that a lot of progressives at the time saw it as kind of an opportunistic move. Um, but like again, like they were just like, yeah, no, we have this former president supporting us, like we're absolutely on board with this.
I mean, when you've got the social capital to spend, you know what I mean? If you're
Yeah,
not
no,
liking the way things are
absolutely.
going, and if the system was rigged against you and you don't like it, and the people actually want it, I mean, that's why he ended up winning again.
Well, no, he didn't though.
Oh,
He
damn.
lost. He lost this time. Um, so he lost in a four-way race because his votes were split with Taft. He actually got
Hmm.
second place. Um, and then fourth place, the socialists ended up, you know, getting I think like almost 20% of the vote, um,
Which is huge
which is gigantic.
for fourth place.
Yeah, hold on. I need to. It should be noted that the Socialist Party of America actually, under Eugene V. Debs, who is a union leader from Indiana, who Bernie Sanders has a portrait of in his office, um, they actually used to do very well in elections. Um,
Right.
and
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 well, I think it's the
they
Red Scare that really,
well, yeah, there's two Red Scares, one during the early 1900s, but
right.
they controlled a few different cities' mayorships. Sorry, no, he got 6% of the vote then, but
Doesn't
he got
matter. That's
almost.
still enormous. Like for
It's
fourth
enormous.
place,
It's
yeah.
enormous. There was one election where they did astronomically well, but this one they actually had like an impact on the election. Um,
Yeah. I don't know if you saw this, but
but
this kind of
the
reminds
point is,
me when the libertarians, like this past election cycle, when they were holding their, debates or whatever, and Trump goes up on stage for the libertarians and they're all, booing him and stuff, which for good reason, because he didn't do a lot of the libertarian things that he said he would. Um, when he's up there and they're all booing him and he just starts shitting on the crowd and he's like, fine, don't vote for me. Keep trailing behind the Green Party. Keep trailing it. You're under 3% and just going off. And it's like, yeah, for this two-party system, they really dominate like 94, 93% of the vote is split between these two. And then the last 6% is just two little parties
right,
and maybe,
right. No, absolutely. And um, again, like the Socialist Party at this time had a lot of union involvement. Um, like they were very much involved with the labor unions, which
right.
again, still illegal. It's not they were illegal, it's just that their activities weren't protected by law, right? They give freedom of association, but you don't have a you weren't allowed to organize in the workplace. You weren't allowed, like they weren't legally recognized as bargaining units.
Right.
So most of the union negotiations and strikes and like this is all very much this had a lot more bloodshed associated with it.
Yeah,
Um,
Sacco Vanzetti, as a lot of people from Milford would be familiar with.
yeah, yep,
All the
yep.
bombings, all the shootings,
Well,
all the
Sacco
everything.
Sacco Sacco actually worked in the Draper Mill,
Right.
in Hopedale, but yeah. So it was just Woodrow Wilson, who was an avowed progressive, um, became president, and enacted a lot of those reforms, including the IRS, among other things. Um, prior to that, most of the federal government was funded by tariffs, but in order to finance the all of the projects the progressives wanted to finance to improve the American people, they enacted the Internal Revenue Service. And there's other things too as well. The Office of Management and Budget, which largely that's an agency when people hear about it, they fall asleep, but its purpose is to take the budget that Congress passes and to make sure that all the departments are adhering to it. So a lot of the ways that the stuff that Doge is ostensibly doing now, you know, um, fall under the purview of the LMB. So all these new aspects of government, protecting national parks, that sort of thing, came about in the progressive era. Um, and then also World War I. Woodrow Wilson wanted to get involved, despite everyone, like many others, not wanting to, because we need to make the world safe for democracy. Was his exact phrase.
Well, it's the
Um,
carrying out of the big stick policy that Roosevelt had too, where it's like, what is it? Quietly with a big stick. I forget what the actual quote is, but you know what I'm
well, so
saying.
so of note, Roosevelt's policy was more or less he said, "Hey, the Western Hemisphere is ours."
Right, right. As
Um,
in from
yeah,
Canada to the tip of what is it, Argentina.
yeah,
That's us. There's no Europe
yeah.
involved
That
over
was
here.
that was his big stick policy. Woodrow Wilson wanted to get involved in the European War, which
Right.
at the time people were like, you know, um,
Yeah, we just
and
left
his reasoning
there.
was, well, his reasoning was essentially, like our our way of life in a government is, if it's more or less in danger if we don't get involved. And Woodrow Wilson also did a lot of very sketchy things as well. He was very much a segregationist. Um,
Well, before we get too much into that, let's just kind of quickly get through the rest of the other
well,
stuff so
yeah,
we can
yeah,
get to
absolutely,
current
absolutely,
events.
absolutely. But like the early progressive movement is not the socially progressive movement we know today.
Right.
Just the point is like, so I'll leave it at that. So also of note, senators were no longer appointed by there's state legislatures. They were directly elected for the first time in the early 1910s,
Hmm.
via constitutional amendment. So that's we haven't been electing senators for that long. But then, of course, after the war, a lot of these progressive sort of changes were put on the back burner because they were like, hey, the economy's great, baby. It's the roaring 20s. we don't need protections.
Nothing could possibly go wrong.
Nothing could go wrong. We should just spend a bunch and we're going to take out all these loans and the banks are going to give all this money.
Everything's
And,
working. Have
the
you ever
weather's
seen a flapper? Ha!
the weather's great. The weather's great. Things are awesome.
We have food.
You know, but none of us drink. Wink, wink. Yeah,
Yeah.
And then, of course, the Great Depression happens, in
Dust
which,
Bowl.
in
Yeah.
the Republicans in there, because they were so, it's not so much they were, because they were tied to such an antiquated view of how the economy worked. At the time, they basically started just trying to cut the budget, enact tariffs, um, and to get that way out of it. They're like, oh well, if we stop spending, well, we can drop inflation, and well, the thing is, it didn't fix it, um,
Right,
because
because this was a brand new monster that had never been seen before.
because
Because
what
we
happened
went,
was
real quick, because we went from a society full of farmers to now most people, not even most people, but a huge percentage of people, I don't know, less than half, but still massive, are living in cities and have their banks and living in New York City is being is constructed and everything else is starting to go on. And we're not dealing with, we're not in Kansas anymore. And it's only been this new style that we're more familiar with today for what, 30 years at that point? 20 years, really? So by
so like
1920 something, it's already
right,
like, yeah,
right. Well, the point is, people weren't spending money because they didn't have money.
right, 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 right.
Like the whole point is like to fight him. Like the whole point is they had to find a way to get people to spend money to spur the economy. And so new President FDR reached into the back burner of progressive policies. And also a lot of the policies pushed by labor unions. Um, and the reason so he basically there are two new deals. The first one, he basically told companies what they couldn't do. You can't cross this line.
Right.
And that wasn't enough. The labor unions really pushed him. The Communist Party was on the rise.
Mm-hmm.
The fascist, they had different names for the fascist party back then because nobody goes out and says I'm a fascist, right? At
Right,
least not in
right, right,
America. Not in America. Um, they had different. They were on the rise, like this figure called Father Tom Coughlin, and labor strikes were getting so violent
right,
that FDR basically, to prevent the country from falling into more chaos, started enacting some of the things they were talking about to try to cut them off the head. Um,
it's
that's
not
the
because
reason.
he was a great guy, it's because things were getting sketchy
Well,
outside.
it's more the working class was so organized and so militant
Right.
that his hands were tied, and he basically was like, "Okay, yeah, no, we'll do this." Um, and so the New Deal happened, um, which spurred all more government involvement in the economy. Um, Enacted Social Security, among other things. Um, the Labor Relations Act that legalized unions. Um, and this basically, like, Roosevelt won landslides every single time. Um, for the first time, like, the entire North was solidly Democratic, which is weird to think about now, but it used to be the South was a stronghold of Democrats and the North was a stronghold of the Republicans. But for the first time, the North was solidly Democratic. Um, after World War II, this ebbed a bit with the Red Scare. Went after several members of Roosevelt's government. Went after labor union leaders. Basically, made them cut their ties with the communists. Um, some of which persists to this day. In Massachusetts, for example, it's not only illegal to be a communist, it's illegal to host communists, like a space for communists to meet. That's a law that's still on the books. Um, so yeah, that happens in the 50s. Um, you know, the but the Republicans largely like got behind the New Deal after a while. They're just a lesser version of it. They're like, no, we're not going after Social Security. That's all said and done. Um, we're not going after this, we're not going after that. We're just here to make it more efficient, make sure the money's spent better, you know.
Sure,
And
sure. So the
because I
1950s, we got
yeah,
the Big Red
it was more
Scare.
like it was yep, we got the big red scare. We've got like a liberal sort of version of the Republican Party.
Life is great. You've
1960s
got
is
the
turbulence.
1950s America, and it's a huge clash from, everyone's back from war and everyone's great, and mom's taking Valium and she's cooking food in Jello because she hates her
Yep,
life, and no one's
yep.
talking about it because everyone has shell shock or PTSD and everything because they just fought a massive war, and there was all this civil stuff going on here at home in the 1950s. In my opinion, was a beautiful painting of what America should be for middle class white people because black people are
Well,
still the
for
hell.
middle class white people, there's still tons of racial strife going on.
No, no, that's what I'm saying. For
Which
middle class white
yeah,
people, it's
right,
just this
right.
beautiful picture for them. And then you got the whole racial stuff that we're not going to worry about because we can't handle that right now as a society. And then we hit the 60s.
And then we hit the 60s, and Medicare passes, which is huge to this day persists. Um, you have
Civil rights
you,
movement
you have the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act passes with
on its
LBJ
third try, I believe,
on
right?
his
Three
third try,
tries?
and
Yeah.
LBJ, a Southerner from Texas, more or less threatening, personally threatening senators to get it to pass. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
like he literally would just go up and say, "I'll destroy your political career if you don't vote for this,"
Dude, he was a
because
weird one. Like just from the things that I've heard about
well,
LBJ.
he was the thing is he was like a major figure in the Senate for decades at that before he became president, and which is why JFK picked him as his vice president. And of course, we have to talk about the JFK assassination. Um,
Yep. Yep.
he of course he represented like a new hope to a lot of people. We talk about that some other time, but more
No,
or
no,
less
yeah,
like
we'll get into that another time because
yeah,
yeah,
but the thing is, LBJ is like was picked because he was so effective at the Senate, which you can almost draw a parallel between why Obama picked Joe Biden and Joe Biden's prime. Um,
he is
you know,
sharp as a tack. You don't know what you're talking about. Joe Biden has never,
yeah.
yeah.
But no, I mean, well, that's the thing. It was almost like if Obama's life was cut short and Joe Biden suddenly was the president and called upon all his Senate contacts to just basically ram through
Hey,
this
we're
stuff
doing
against
this
their
shit
will.
now. Yeah. Well, and actually
That's
A lot of Americans don't know this because we're talking about the JFK assassination. JFK got assassinated, and in the airplane, while he was being sworn in, there was a Secret Service agent who tried to murder LBJ in the plane, like within a day or two, or maybe 3 days, whatever it is, that amount of time while he's being sworn in the plane. And I'm not even going to go conspiracy route with that, but just think about that. The president is assassinated, and then immediately afterwards, the vice president, as he's being sworn in on the plane, somebody tries to kill him from
yeah.
the Secret Service.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. All sorts of crazy stuff happened. It's the 60s. And that's kind of the point, right? All sorts of crazy stuff happened. Vietnam, civil rights movement.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So Vietnam, which was, basically our Iraq War, which was the boomers' Vietnam. No,
yeah,
it's
I
before
mean,
boomer, the
to be
silent
honest,
generation.
at this point, like I would
No, the
its
boomers.
impact upon the political election on the election of 1968 was very similar to the Gaza war on this past election, I would say.
Sure.
Um, you had at the convention, you
Except
had
nobody wanted to end it. And nobody said anyway. Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
well,
Sorry.
no, they did want to end
No,
it.
no,
That's the
Gaza,
thing.
Gaza.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
think the activists that were there wanted to.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
and but the problem is
Sorry, we're having an issue
like
again. It's going to
you
make
basically
me, real quick, it's going to make me shut this down again in 10 minutes. Um, I already shut down Zoom and
okay.
everything.
I'll try.
Let me, let me, yeah,
Uh,
let's finish up. Let's get up to the modern era. We'll take a pause and then we'll
yeah, we'll
redo
just
this.
finish up. We're almost at modern times. Nixon basically showed all the pandemonium happening at the Democratic convention, tied it to the pandemonium happening throughout the country. Said, "Hey, look at what happens. The Democrats are crazy. Your kids are doing acid. Blah blah blah. They're doing acid and they're out there. they're dressing like the
Premarital
blacks.
sex.
He didn't say that, but that was the implication of everything he was saying. And he wasn't against this. He wasn't against civil rights, but he certainly wasn't for it. He kind of threaded the needle in a way that he sailed into election, one of the closest elections in history.
Hmm.
And when he was there, he immediately turned the FBI into his own personal sort of like
Yep.
army. Um,
Watergate. Yep.
going after people, which, you know, eventually led to his downfall, which is funny because in 1972 he won in a landslide. He didn't need to break into the office. Every state went red except for Massachusetts, which is why they started making bumper stickers that said, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts," after Watergate happened. Um,
Yeah.
Jimmy, also at this time, there was oil shocks throughout the world that caused inflation to go up. Now, remember what I said before? Inflation, the way to get out of an inflationary, usually the way to get out of a depression or slow down the economy is to spur people to spend,
Right.
right? And that was since the Great Depression, that had been the consensus.
Things hit a turn for the worst. Start printing it. Start making people spend it.
Start people making spend. It called boost aggregate demand.
Right.
That was the mantra. However, there was this group of people, the monetarists, led by Milton Friedman, who were like, actually, well, what if that doesn't happen? All you're going to do is cause what's called stagflation, um, and then you'll have a stagnant economy and inflation. And people are like, that can't happen. That's craziness.
Huh.
Well,
Huh.
what happened was exactly that, because there was an oil shock, because there was an oil supply crisis. So of course prices went up, but it didn't matter how much you spent because or it didn't prices went up, the economy slowed down. You couldn't spend your way out of the economy because the prices were going up not due to increased economic activity, they're going up because of supplies going up.
Right.
And so we just couldn't kick the inflation. Because of Watergate, Jimmy Carter became president. Um, and he started trying some radical things to get inflation under control. For example, he appointed noted monetarist Paul Volcker to the Federal Reserve, who was very much like of the opinion we need to fight inflation by like tanking the economy, more or less. He's like, we need to get people to spend less right now. We need to do it.
Yeah, which is an argument to be made by a lot of
Well,
economists, and because on one side, when you spend your way out of a depression or a recession, at the end of the tunnel is what we're seeing now in last year, in the year before, when we spent our way out of COVID. Why didn't COVID ruin the U.S. the global economy? Because everyone printed money like crazy, and then you're like, oh wow, inflation
mhm.
hit like 40%. Like this is insane. Yeah. That's what happens. Sometimes, though, you have to take the huge hit and it's going to suck for a year, maybe
Oh,
2 years, but that'll get you past it. So it's not so bad. Because if you put it off and put it off, anyway,
well, so this is a kind of a newer
it is a new,
idea.
yes. Well, it's all
At
new,
this
really.
at this time it was called a new type of liberalism, because liberalism was always like, open markets, open society.
1 second. This is a perfect spot to pause it because now
Yeah,
we've gotten to
yeah,
liberalism. Let me pause
absolutely.
this.
So yeah, just to kind of recap where we're at in history. Watergate just happened. Um, through Watergate, Nixon had more or less abused his power and taken several of the nation's intelligence and law enforcement federal level organizations, and used them for his own political purposes. Um, the economy was in stagnation as well as inflation, which was supposed to be unheard of. And also, something going on in the foreign world, um, the United States has entered a policy of détente against the Soviet Union.
I think this is also worth mentioning too. So going back 10 years or 15 years, on January 17th, 1961, President Eisenhower, on his farewell address, said, in the councils of government, we must guard against acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So in 1961, a president leaving office, this guy who was one of the generals during World War II, was like, hey, military-industrial complex exists. If we don't curtail the powers of the intelligence agencies, of the defense contractors, of the military, these things are going to continue and it's going to go out of control. And then we got wrapped up in presidential assassinations, which he touched up on. Then we got wrapped up in what's it called, Vietnam for 20 years.
Right. I mean, my viewpoint is.
Sorry, do you need a sec to get back to your?
Give me 1 sec.
All right.
My viewpoint, he was very much talking about the military contractors, the arms manufacturers,
right,
the Raytheons of the world, dictating American policy, and also, in addition, sort of forming kind of like a backdoor, the backdoor leverage to American foreign policy, right? So you have people who would be generals, then on the boards of these defense companies, then back in the office. But of note, in the 70s, we began a policy of détente towards the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
We tried to turn the Cold War even more cold. We tried to not strengthen relations, but dial back the heat. We also normalized relations with communist China at that point. In the background,
and that's when we adopted the one China policy, which every president since then has signed on to.
Exactly. Yep. Ping pong diplomacy. Where our ping pong teams went and played in their ping pong leagues and vice versa. But not everybody in government liked this, right?
Right.
Also, the ones that didn't like this, also saw this as an opportunity for the Soviet Union, who supported the Palestinians, basically, they saw it as an opportunity for other actors to rise that were opposed to American interests. And there's people who were involved in certain governmental positions, like Donald Rumsfeld.
Horrible person.
Yeah, but he was there back in the 70s. But also, there's a U.S. senator, a Democratic senator named Scoop Jackson, out of Washington, who formed this whole idea of a new sort of conservatism, and a lot of former leftists who largely were Jewish. I'm saying this because it's a fact. A lot of them were former leftists who were Jewish, who did not like the way the left approached the Palestinian question, because they thought it was unfair to what they saw as a country that formed in the wake of the Holocaust, was their people being left out to dry. And so they became conservatives and became prominent in conservative circles, became prominent in foreign policy circles, basically advocating for this. The U.S. needs to step up, trying to collapse communism. We need to defend against our enemies. This isn't going to be a multipolar world. We need to make it a unipolar world where the U.S. controls everything.
Now, I need to step in here because what you're just okay. So, brief overview: neoliberalism, right? And you can correct me when I'm wrong.
I'm describing neoconservatism.
Conservatism. I know. Neoliberalism. American interests are good because it works out so well. The rest of the world should do American interests, and then neoconservatism is neoliberalism is good, and we can make the rest of the world do what we want them to
Well,
do. And so we
so
can
so
use one sec, and we can use the military in order to do that too, and we're not afraid of it. That's my understanding of neoliberalism and neoconservatism and how they go hand in hand.
so neoconservatism is concerned with foreign policy.
Right.
Neoliberalism is what I was describing a second ago. So neoliberalism was what emerged in response to stagflation.
Hmm.
Um, Liberalism had always been open society, open markets. Neoliberalism emerged as we need to do something about this inflation. Gerald Ford had everybody wear these buttons that said "whip inflation now" to remind them to cut spending in their own households, which obviously didn't work. Um, so they turned to more radical measures, which they saw as cutting government spending. Um, Cutting also the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, that from its inception, its goal was the goal of the Federal Reserve when it emerged um, around the time of the Great Depression. Its guiding purpose was to keep unemployment as low as humanly possible. It gained a second mission, which is to keep inflation as low as humanly possible in the 70s. So those are the two missions of the Federal Reserve: keep inflation low, keep unemployment low. Those are often at odds, um, because in order to keep inflation low, you have to cool the economy. So neoliberalism emerged. Jimmy Carter put Paul Volcker in the Federal Reserve, but obviously he was a liberal
Well,
Democrat.
give a definition of what neoliberalism is.
Yeah, so neoliberalism is originally the notion that the world is one big marketplace. Um, the government spending, government involvement, just muddies the waters, and we need to cut the government out of the economy as much as humanly possible.
So big business gets free reins, let them work it because the world works this way as a market.
Right. The world works as an open market.
Right.
Um, Open market, open borders, open society. Um, and Jimmy Carter had several neoliberals he put in positions in his government. He started deregulating things, so slashing some of those New Deal era regulations.
Hmm.
Um, then Ronald Reagan became president. And like I said, several of the neoconservatives that kind of fled the Democratic Party started getting closer to the Republican Party and impacting Republican foreign policy. Um,
And
and
then give a definition for neoconservatism.
Neoconservatism is the notion that um, that a unipolar world order should be sought with the United States at its helm.
So like Pax Americana or American hegemony, US global superpower.
U.S. global superpower forever.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, and in order to do this, we need to quickly wipe out the Soviet Union.
Yep. Yep.
We need to make sure these other threats to the American global order um, are taken out. So yeah, so they became close with Reagan. Reagan also, had advisors ranging from Milton Friedman and so on, who were prominent neoliberals, and they basically set to bring inflation under control. They did what was called the Volcker shock, which is a massive raising of the interest rates that led to a massive recession
Right.
in the early 80s. Unemployment rate sharply went up, wages sharply went down, still haven't recovered. Um, but it did bring inflation under control. It was called shock therapy. Um, so that kind of became the dominant paradigm from then on because inflation got brought under control. The jobs started going overseas. The unions were busted. He fired all the air traffic controllers when they would stage a strike. He fired them all, which was unheard of at that time in New Deal America. But it forever changed the relationship between it changed the nature of the federal government. All these social programs he set out to cut them. And he did. And the Democrats were in this position where they said, "Oh, okay," because essentially what happened was the neoliberals had been saying for years, government spending causes inflation, and there's a point when the economy might slow down, um, and they were proven right by this
Right.
one circumstance. Um, so there emerged this sort of feeling in the Democratic Party in order to beat the Republicans, we have to become better like the Republicans, but more efficient. Enter Bill Clinton.
Enter Bill
Bill
Clinton.
Clinton. Bill Clinton basically, he was a small government Democrat. He ran as a small government Democrat. He ran as, look, hey, I'm going to take a pencil, like, we're going to make things as efficient as possible, right? There's all this graft and corruption, but we're going to approach government from sort of a non-emotional standpoint. Like we're not going to start cutting things like crazy. We're going to look at things from like sort of a technocratic point of view, and you know what works works. We're going to have science behind it. You know, he notably had meetings with all sorts of people, notably both the Republican and the Democratic nominee in 1992. Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush supported NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement,
Yeah,
which is this massive free trade.
But Republicans couldn't pass NAFTA. So instead you needed this like nice, smooth talking, jazz sax playing,
Well,
ladies man Bill
it did
Clinton to come in
it
and just
did
squeeze NAFTA through.
it
Repeal
did pass under
Glass-Steagall.
it did pass under George H.W. Bush, but Bill Clinton was certainly in favor of it and um put very much pushed it and helped implement it. But of note, a third party candidate, Ross Perot, who was talking about how to bring tariffs back and that sort of stuff, and we need to protect jobs, and you know, a very populist platform in 1992, got almost 20% of the vote. Um, and at one point in the polls, he was leading the two major candidates. Um, he went on to form the Reform Party, which competed in the 1996 elections with Ross Perot. Um, also doing very well, not quite they got in 1992. In 2000, a right wing social conservative, Pat Buchanan, tried to hijack it. And there's this other person who ran for the Reform Party in 2000 by the name of Donald Trump, um, who was in the primary for a very brief period of time, but he got out because he said your party's full of weirdos who are very homophobic and hate are racist KKK types. I don't think I want to be part of that. Um,
Which is funny because actually Trump is a weird one. I actually just found out a couple months ago. I'm sure I knew it, but then I forgot. Trump was the first president to run for president already supporting gay marriage.
yep, he was.
Yeah,
He's a very bizarre figure.
he
I
still
mean,
is. Yeah.
still is. I mean, I think it's again like I don't like to look at like individuals impacting history. It's the forces around
It's
them.
the movement. Right,
It's the
right.
movement, and it's more like there's this billionaire guy that was like, I want, the Reform Party is this thing. Notably though, like they very much supported tariffs and a lot of the stuff that Donald Trump's talking about in trade to this day, he talked about then. So that's one thing that's been consistent with him. Um, 2000s happened, 9/11 happened. The neocons were like, "Hey, look, this is what we've been warning about. If we don't keep things under control, we're going to, it's going to be pandemonium. Like we're going to have 9/11s every week, you know." Um, And so George W. Bush's presidency was completely run by the neocons who had been there kind of in the back like rafters of the Republican Party since the 80s. Enacting their plan to maintain global supremacy, um, you know, with Afghanistan, then with Iraq. Um, and also like unilaterally just oppose all these international institutions that were set up since the end of the World War, like the UN, be damned because the US is the boss. Um, Also, we kept deregulating things in line with neoliberalism. Um, you mentioned Glass-Steagall was repealed under Bill Clinton, which separated investment banks and savings banks. George W. Bush pushed the partial privatization of Social Security, something that couldn't pass because that's the third rail of American politics for now.
Yeah.
You don't take away people's Social Security. You don't take away people's Medicare. Um, at least not at once. The Great Recession happened, which, in a sane society would essentially, again, it's the opposite that happened in the 70s, in that, we've been focusing so much for so long keeping inflation under control. We didn't focus on the other aspects of it, the regulatory structures. So the Great Recession happened, and instead of restructuring society at that point, instead of restructuring the economy, reorienting it in a different direction, we more or less did much of the same.
We doubled
Um,
down. We
we
doubled
doubled
down.
down. We
Yeah,
doubled
actually,
down.
I want to step in on this one. So I actually disagree with what you just said. I don't think that they said, well, we're focusing on this, and then they just didn't focus on the regulatory aspects. Because I don't think that the people who actually make decisions, like you were saying, I'm not talking about individual people, I'm talking about the movement.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah.
obviously, there's economists and whatever. I think that it was a very conscious decision to keep the regulations and everything where they were, and just keep things as they were. And in
No, I agree with
2008,
that totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
and in 2008, when the great financial crisis happened, or the Great Recession, whatever you want to call it, I think it was, for one, very, very, very deliberate when, as we saw in WikiLeaks, the entire Obama cabinet was picked from an email sent out by Citigroup, Citibank. And when you have, the at the time, who I don't remember if he's currently, but at least during COVID, he was the governor of New Jersey. Crap, I forget his name right now. Murphy, I think. I don't know. He's from Newton, Mass.
Yeah.
But he was a
Murphy,
vice pres.
Paul Murphy. Bill Murphy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's Phil Murphy. He was the vice president of Goldman Sachs Asia, which is an enormous thing. And then in the 2008 financial crisis, he became the leader of the DNC, or one of the whatever it's called, one of the chairs of the
Yep.
DNC. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, this guy came from banking to lead the DNC. Obama gets an email from another big bank telling him who to pick for his cabinet. The great financial crisis happens, and instead of, I don't know, like what you just said, reorganizing how we're structuring our society, renegotiating the social contract between people and our government. They doubled down, bailed out all of the big banks, and my family was one of the 5 million families who lost their homes in 2008 and 2009. And I think it's absolutely beyond criminal that none of these people have ever had to pay for it. When I almost became homeless, when we lost our car, when a whole slew of things occurred to
Right.
my
No,
family.
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just going on a rant because I'm just mad about it. But when everything horrible happened to my
No, as
family,
you
and we
should be.
continued with business as normal in this country, and then obviously, and okay, and then we elect Obama again in 2012. It was my first time voted for Obama. Okay, cool. We went from 2 wars to 7 wars. In my opinion, Obama was the worst president in our lifetime. Let's just call it that, our lifetime.
I still think I would still think it was George W. Bush, but
But I don't think half of the things that happened under Obama could have happened under Bush. Bush was worried about, the Middle East war, and then everything that got snuck in, Patriot
well,
Act and
you also
everything there.
also Katrina, also, the
Yeah.
continue, like
No.
my
It was
thing is,
crisis after crisis with Bush. Absolutely. I'll give him that. There was a lot of
well,
shit
I
going
still
on.
think, yeah, but like, just to get back, so in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a book written by this political scientist, neoconservative named Francis Fukuyama, um, called The End of History.
Mm,
And the central argument was, hey, look, we fought this ideological war against the Soviet Union, and two things happened: capitalism won, and democracy won.
right.
And you know what? There's not going to be any other ideological conflicts beyond this because we have reached the end of conflicts in history. Um, you know, everything that happens now is going to be a conflict over identity.
He said this?
Whether you be joined, yeah, yes,
Huh.
it's it's called the end of history. It has been it was incredibly influential up until, well, um, you know, the the superstructure of neoliberalism was
Shook to
basic.
its core.
Yeah, because it more or less it was the guiding principle of the post-Cold War world.
Right.
Um, yeah, like there's gonna be conflicts that pop up, but they're gonna be like, hey, we don't like the West, or
We
hey,
don't like this thing. And yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah, but he basically is like, nobody's gonna argue against capitalism, no one's gonna argue against liberal democracy and be able to defeat it in a reasoned manner. Um, we need to start tearing down all of the barriers to trade, among other things. And, you know, the whole notion at the time was, hey, there's one way to do things, and that way is probably best exemplified by bloodless bureaucrats who work for banks. You know, those are the people that know how to do things. They manage everything. And so a lot of that, what you're talking about, the emails coming, is because they literally that notion was like, hey, unless you want to tank the economy, these are the people you're going to listen to. Um, and they're saying that the banks are too big to fail, so you have to give them money. Um,
Yeah, and then right after the banks failed, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where we're talking about, I didn't say pressure cooker, but basically pressure cooker. You deal with the crisis now, or it gets pushed back and
oh,
off-putting builds
absolutely.
up. And so great that like the economy failed. We entered in a recession. We bailed out the banks, and then people ended up screwed. And then what happens right after that? Obama gets elected again. Okay, cool, but it was still, this conservative Republican, whatever, still everybody in line. And then paved the way. It was directly because of Clinton, Bush, and Obama era policies, which were the same economic policies
Well,
all around,
I
which
would I would
paved the
say
way
I
for
would
Trump.
say I would say it started with Carter and Reagan in the
Sure, sure. I mean, you're the better
re-regulation.
buff than I am, and
Well, but
yeah,
it was this whole massive deregulation of the economy, of the government, combined with this neoconservative foreign policy of we need to establish an American empire and maintain it.
right,
Um,
right. I mean, plus all the coups and all the governments that we overthrew in the
well,
70s, the
okay,
80s,
yeah, I was
the
gonna say
crack
we've done that
epidemic,
forever.
like there's 1,000 things that go on behind the scene. But I mean, the nail in the coffin was the Obama presidency. And then you end up with Trump. Then there was a reaction against Trump. We ended up going back to Biden, right? Back to like the establishment, everything the way that it should be.
Well,
And
so
then
so
1 second. And then
absolutely.
after, the Biden administration, for better or worse, however it is that you feel about it, 30 something million more Americans voted to go back to Trump. And I think that people have this blinder on where they want to come back to identity. It's because of race, it's because of this or because of what. Nobody votes. I mean, not enough people vote based on race or based on identity or those kind of like the more modern arguments that we're making about culture. And significantly more people vote based in line with their wallet and and their living situation. And so it totally makes sense when through Obama 2008 to 2016 Black people didn't make nearly as much money. It took Trump, what is it, 2018 or 2017? No, later, 2019, for Black Americans to reach the same peak of wealth that they hit under Obama 2008, like his first year before the great financial crisis.
Right.
And with the price of everything going and exploding, which you could argue a lot of that is because of the spending bills that went through during COVID, during Trump's administration, because a lot of that was under him, not taking that away from him. But still, there was this huge, we can't go back to business as usual. And now you've got this riverboat casino captain, Donald Trump, running and winning a second time. And I think this is just a critique for everybody, but I think unless people start to open their eyes and realize that the way things were before, unless you offer real substantive change, you're going to get somebody bad. And
Well, so
last point, I'll turn this back to you. The problem is not, in my opinion, Donald Trump. the problem is who will come to fill the shoes right after Donald Trump, because you're going to have the same fight. The Democrats will not learn their lesson, and the Republicans can't break from Trump. He's the one that won. So who's going to fill the shoes for the next administration?
So, I feel like we're in another sort of political era. I said
Yeah,
earlier,
yeah, yeah, 100%.
I think it started with Donald Trump. And
Yeah.
of note, right from Carter through Obama, this neoliberalism has persisted where it's, you need to slash as much as you can.
Hmm.
Government has less of a, we need to slash all the barriers to trade, slash, you know, join the international
Deregulate.
community.
Yeah,
Yeah,
NAFTA,
regular.
exactly.
Well, so of note, like even Biden, who I think, like you said, represents the return to the established order in a lot of ways, he kept a lot of those steel tariffs, um, which would have been unheard of 10 years before. He passed the largest spending bill on social programs since the Great Society. And I'm not saying this as a, an attaboy for Biden. There's
No,
several
no,
reasons.
sure.
What I'm saying is there's been a shift, right? Um, the notion of the government spending to like we've kind of like come back to the central precepts um, of the progressive era in a lot of ways on those things. Um, Under at least the first Trump presidency and in the Biden presidency, like I think that there was a sort of like idea like, okay, we have to at least like look like we're doing something, right? Um,
Sure. Sure. Yeah, we have to at
and
least, yeah, and pay the
well,
lip
because
service and we got to do stuff.
there's been such a um wave of backlash against the elites
Right.
that I think and you're seeing in both parties try to embrace it too. Like back under Obama, they were still talking about wealth creators, largely, or job creators.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, I mean, you had Kamala Harris actually pitch price controls as a means to control inflation, which again is unheard of in the post neoliberalism era. Now, of course, she abandoned this to go on the campaign trail with Liz Cheney, um, you know, but it just you're seeing little snippets of a turn towards a different way. Now, I don't think the Democratic Party, um, like you said, is going to learn its lesson, so to speak. I don't think I think there's a reason. Like I think it's beholden to too many um, of the same donors that the Republican Party is to fully do that.
100%.
Um, but of note, like, and also, as I said, after Watergate, you had this sort of like they really put the separation of powers back up. The president had been doing so much in the 50s and 60s. The office of the presidency was responsible for so much. After Watergate, Congress kind of said, okay, some of this is our authority now. Um, so I think what you're seeing is, at least in this presidency, I think you're seeing the presidency try to reassert itself to um, tear down some of those barriers that were put up, which was something that Bush tried to do but couldn't get enough people on board to do so. It was called the unitary executive theory. It's something Cheney very much pushed. Um, and I also think we're going to see the push for government to really play a bigger role in people's lives in the economy. Um, Now, how this goes about, like I'm interested to see what happens because like there's like dueling
Yes.
there's two dueling sort of narratives forming. One is the more libertarian one pushed by the Musks, um, being like, hey, let's cut every single government organization to its bare bones. Um, which, you can argue, oh, we're just auditing it. Like, it's,
Yeah, yeah, I'd actually like to
but
step in real quick for this. So one thing that I think is it sucks. I actually just had the same pop up again. We only have like 8 minutes before we have to deal with that again,
yeah,
or we can save this for another time. But I
yeah,
did want to touch up on
we
I do want to touch up on this. So one really important thing to take note of right now is that, so with the rise of BRICS, right, we have a new currency that's going to spread right now about 40% of the world's population. I'm not even going to go by number of countries because that doesn't matter, but 40% of the world's population is going to adopt BRICS. And so there's going to be some sort of a trade war. And it is signaling the end of American hegemony. Now, the reason that I think that Trump is fine with slashing performing full audits, let's use that term for right now, but performing full audits of all these agencies is because we're 36, 37 trillion dollars in debt. And this is numbers, not conspiracy theory. You can look it up. It's very easy to see. By 2035, if spending doesn't stop, the amount of interest accrued on the debt is going to be higher than we could ever possibly raise money to pay off the debt. And so we're going to end up hitting the point of no return where the dollar will become useless. Some countries like Japan don't really have an issue with this, even though they've been living with it for like 12 years in that past that point of no return. But their economy is a fraction of the United States, and this is going to have long-lasting ripple effects. And so I think that, I mean, with 2008 Rand Paul revolution, cut the spending, stop the spending when we were only at like $7 trillion of debt, when he called it like he saw it 20 years ago, 15 years ago, is that we have to get ahead of this issue now if we have any hope of not actually completely tanking and becoming nothing. And we can be, kind of mealy-mouthed about it and say, well, it's some of this or it's some of that, or we can take little steps. But I think that it makes total sense that we're having somebody come in with rapid, drastic changes to suddenly change the budget so we can end up hitting a surplus and hopefully start to go down. Which I think
yeah.
I will say this, I will be both equally surprised and unsurprised if somehow Donald Trump manages to sell the idea of the single payer healthcare to the United States from a financial standpoint. I'll be both surprised and not surprised because
Well,
that'll
see,
slash 700 billion
I'll,
off the
I'll,
budget.
I'll be surprised because of his actions so far, and I'll be surprised because of his actions so far, as well as the comments by Robert Kennedy during his hearing, um, where
Mm.
he essentially said, "Hey, Americans love private insurance. Americans want to be on private." He attacked Medicaid. He attacked Medicare, as more or less like basically he said they're costing Americans tons of money because they allow people like smokers to mess up um the healthcare pool.
That's not exactly. I mean, maybe that's what he said a little bit in the hearing, but his bigger gripe, because I've listened to a lot of RFK, because obviously I supported him before he dropped out, and well, I wasn't wholeheartedly because of Gaza, but his bigger issue is that we have such a middleman, and we have I'm sorry, we have regulatory capture where the Medicare isn't even allowed to negotiate its own prices. They just got a couple more drugs that they're allowed to, but on a whole, they're not allowed to even function like a regular insurance company like a regular insurance company. And that's why their budget is either above, below, or just at, the military industrial
Yeah,
complex.
I mean, I would go back and listen to the hearings because he essentially, when directly asked about Medicare negotiating prices, he more or less
I'll look that up because
he
that's not congruent with things that he said in the
oh
past.
no,
So
that's
I'll definitely
what I
look it
mean.
up.
He got there and he attacked Medicaid. He basically said, oh, Medicaid, it's costing American taxpayers, and the drug companies love Medicaid. Um,
They do.
yeah,
They
well, when
do.
Bernie Sanders straight up asked, do you want to allow us to negotiate drug prices and import drugs from Canada? He sort of whiffed on it. He said, in
Okay.
theory, yes, but you know and he said, "Do you believe healthcare should be a human right?" And he said, "I can't say. You have people like smokers who are um causing the pool to be much more expensive, which is the
Oh,
exact art.
God forbid,
Oh no,
yeah.
but the point
But
is
that's what he said, yeah.
that's the exact argument that for-profit health insurance companies were making when they tried to get rid of pre-existing conditions.
Right, right. I remember
Yeah.
that.
So he's basically they're arguing, hey, these like it's almost like they're trying to take. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I
But
hear you.
I no, I was genuinely again, like I have my own gripes with Robert Kennedy. I very much I don't like populists who like quote unquote populists who come from incredibly like you know
Yeah, American
well established
aristocracy.
yeah establishment anti-establishment folks. It's like Musk being like we're against the establishment. It's like you're the richest man in the world. You're the biggest establishment person there is because you know you are the establishment. Like everything you have government contracts from everything related to your satellites to your cars to the
Boring company making tunnels. Yeah,
technology used for PayPal. You know, you are the establishment. So that's the thing. Faux populism really annoys me. I'm very much, maybe this is a subject for another time because we've gone a very long time now. But and very much like I believe the animating piece of history is class struggle. Um, and when you have different groups, I think what's happening is they are very much playing upon a real phenomenon and real feelings. Um, it's just like the direction they're turning that rage and anger is the one
right,
I'm concerned.
right.
Yeah.
No, no, I agree with you
It's not it's
100%
not like
there.
they're speaking to something very real in a much more effective way than the other side is. I just worry what they're going to do with it. That's all. That's what I'll leave it at.
Yeah,
And
I think I think that's a good place to end it.
yeah. Hey, that was a good one. I
Thanks,
like
thanks for coming.
absolutely. I'm sorry if I rambled.
I ramble too. I ramble. Don't even worry about it.
We could call it two guys with ADD on a like have a podcast or something.
Two autistic ADHD people on a
Yeah, exactly.
podcast.
Exactly. We could call it special interest the podcast. You know,
All right, Tom.
yeah, that
Thank
could be a
you.
double that could be a like a pun too. Special interest.
Special interests. Oh yeah, I
All right.
got it.
All right, man. Hey, enjoy your Sunday.
You
I
too.
look forward to hearing it. See you.